I'll not share my screen for a moment just to introduce myself. I'm Marco Cite Valencia. I'm our open education librarian. This is Cite Me Maybe, open access publishing for graduate students. Jaleesa just hit the recording button. So just as an FYI, we do record these sessions and they will be shared on the library's YouTube channel in the future. So thank you so much everyone for coming. It's a nice little group that we've got here. And thanks to the folks who are joining in after the fact, watching this session. If you have any questions, like Jaleesa says, you can make sure to put them in the chat. Jaleesa is going to be facilitating that chat, like I mentioned. So if you throw something in there, she can help make sure that I see it. If I don't see a raised hand, Jaleesa, feel free to unmute and interrupt me for anything that's timely for sure. Okay, so with that, we're going to dive right in. I do want to share one quick link with you all, and that's going to be to tinyurl.com. Cite Me Maybe, and it is case sensitive, so it looks like this. And hopefully when you click on that button, it's going to take you to this document. And this document that it's going to go to is a helper doc. It's where I put all the links that I'm going to be discussing today. So we'll be referring to that throughout. And just the link again, tinyurl.com, Cite Me Maybe. That's where that lives at. All right, so with that, let's dive into the presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and make this big. And Jaleesa, let me know if there's any issues with what's showing up on the screen for people. This is our little intro slide, obviously. I'm Marco Cite Valencia. I'm open education librarian and associate professor here at the University of Idaho Library. I serve the College of Education, Health, and Human Sciences as a liaison, and I also serve our campus generally on all things open. So a couple things I want to point out to you on this slide. There's some voting options, thumbs down, thumbs up, or question. So we will be using those in a little bit. So keep that on your radar. And if you want to participate in some of the even more interactive parts, go to menti.com and put in this code, 8932-8609. So if you can fire that up, 8932-8609 at menti.com, then you can participate in these polls as we work our way through. That information is on each slide too. So if you get inspired or forget or close your browser, you can join in. All right. So let's keep it going here. These are just those same instructions again. If you like to use the QR code, there you have it. I'll leave that for just a second for folks, and we'll just keep on cruising. So this is Cite Me Maybe, open access publishing for graduate students. And as you know, this is part of the University of Idaho Graduate Student Essential Series, where we teach you core skills that will help you now and in your future scholarly endeavors. So the first question that I have is for you all. When I hear open access, I think of what? So this should be a free text response option. If you can just put in a few thoughts about what comes to mind when you hear open access, that'd be great. Right, I forgot this is the word cloud one, which is kind of fun. So free, journals, equity, software, Linux, unique. These are great answers here. So one of the things you can see is that some folks have identified that open is often related to software development. So that's one of the areas that arguably the movement originates from in many ways. And a lot of people are identifying that free, right? Free is a really critical part of open access. We know it's open because there's not a cost associated with it, and likely anything that has a cost is not open. Okay, accessible journals, great. So good starting knowledge that people have. Let's kind of go a little bit further in understanding what you already know about this topic. So I'd like for you to rate your knowledge on the following topics. So open access publishing, the specific topic we're talking about today, scholarly publishing in general, what we do for open at the University of Idaho, specifically open access in this case, but also just open in general, and how to get started publishing using open access. How comfortable do you feel doing that already? So this should give you just a few options here where you can vote on these and rate your knowledge. All right, so people feel like they know the most about scholarly publishing in general and the least about how to get started publishing using OA. So that's great. This is a great session that we're all here for then. Open accessing publishing and support for open with U of I kind of in the middle there. All right, so hopefully by the end of the session, we've increased our knowledge on all of these. But I do realize the way I've set this up is actually as a sort of a ranking of these when I probably wanted more of a vote on each of them. So note to self for later. But let's just kind of keep moving through some of these questions I have to start us off. And this is also just for me to understand where you're at. So what's your experience level with publishing? Are you an unpublished author? Are you a published author? Maybe you've had one article. Or are you a seasoned pro? Maybe you've got published author in multiple venues. You have done academic publishing before. Where are you at? Okay. So experience-wise, we've got some unpublished folks, some seasoned pros, and someone who's been to the rodeo once or twice, but still getting their sea legs, so to speak. That's great. So hopefully this session is going to be useful to everyone, regardless of their previous skill level here. I always ask this question so I can kind of tailor the content. And this is nice because we've got a group here that's got a range of experience. So with that, I will keep moving. I also have a little bit of information about the registrations. I know we have a lot of graduate students who have signed up for this. So with this, what are you most excited to learn about today? We have identifying legit open journals, how to pay for article processing charges, what is open access, just generally speaking, how to spot predatory journals, what options does U of Idaho have, or something else? And for the something else, feel free to put it in the chat. I can try to include it in the conversation if we can get it in there. Okay, so while people are voting on that, I am going to see if I can access the chat. Okay. Perfect. Jaleesa, thank you for putting that instruction on how to access Menti. And just to remind people as well, while people vote on this, tinyurl.com, cite me maybe is the helper doc. Perfect. Someone says they don't know that much about publishing in general, so they're hoping to learn about that while also learning about open. That's great. I have a couple of slides that hopefully will do just that for you. Okay, so let's look at our results here. People are wondering about what options does U Idaho have? That's our most voted on one. And then how to identify legit open journals. People aren't as worried about how to pay for article processing charges, which is very interesting. Maybe as we advance through, that might be a question that comes up. And then some general questions about what is open access and how do we identify those predatory journals. So with that, let's go ahead and get going. This is sort of an overview of how a typical research article gets created in a standard process that's not specifically open. I also will take this opportunity to just say that all of the sources that I use are listed over here as well. And so you can dive in and find more on each of these topics as you're interested. So this graphic comes from the Creative Commons, which is an organization that creates and administers the Creative Commons licenses that you've probably heard of and does a lot of open advocacy in general. And what they're showing here is the kind of standard process for how a research article might be created. So in this case, this is something that's a government RFP, so a referral for proposals are announced, research grants are awarded, the research is conducted, the article is created and submitted to journals for peer review. The acceptance in journal also transfers the copyright to the publisher. The article publishes in typically closed or firewalled journals where people need to pay. So here's library subscribing or the public paying to access the article. And the public is not granted any right or ability to access this beyond that paid access to read it. And they're also not able to remix or reuse the content in any way. And Creative Commons says this has resulted in slow scientific progress with poor return on public investment. Now, arguably, a lot of the scientific progress we had until, I don't know, the 1990s period followed this model. And, you know, we invented quite a lot of things and made technological progress. But part of what they're getting at is there's a lot of advantages to a more open process. So here they're putting forth how this might work in an optimized funding cycle for research articles where we have an open output. So similarly, we start at the same kind of place where there's a kind of inception, the start of the research is conducted, the article is submitted to journals and peer reviews. One of the important things to know here is that a lot of government grants are now requiring open publications at the end. So to kind of come back here, you see that open license requirements included. That's increasingly becoming a de facto part of a lot of the federal funding that you might receive. And so right from the start, you need to start thinking about how will this be open research on the end. So the article goes through the same kind of process in terms of when it's created, but then it's submitted to a journal where it's often then put into an open repository as a preprint, which we'll go more into what those are and how to use them in a little bit. But the idea is it's that version of the article before it's fully published can be shared in different places. And then the article is actually published in a traditional journal or a regular journal here, excuse me, under an embargo, which is where it can basically be firewalled or you have to pay to access it for a year, or it can just be directly published as open. But the goal is ideally that is in an open access repository, the public actually has a degree of rights over reuse and remix, and it ideally accelerates that scientific progress and optimal output research. So this is one vision of these research cycles. I have a few more slides that will talk us through some of this, but it kind of helps you to see one of the crucial differences here is that output at the end and that financial element. So if you don't know anything about open access, this is one of the main things to take away is that there's a real emphasis on making sure that the research at the end is available for people to read, for other researchers to use it, and ideally for there not to be a financial cost associated with that, it needs to be in some kind of open access repository. Okay, so to work through this session together, I know this topic can be a bit dry, and so I thought I'd put up some myths and we could vote on them, and then I'd use those as an opportunity to explain more about that topic. So one of the first OA myths that you may have heard of is that there's quality concerns about open access. So this myth says open access publications don't undergo peer review and are of lower quality than conventional publishers. So I'd love if you could use that little voting button down at the bottom right corner. Thumbs down if you think this is not true, and thumbs up if you think that this is true, and question mark if you're like, I don't know. So take a few moments. We'll have people vote on this. And there are no wrong answers here. So I did put a few in here that maybe might trick you a little bit. So don't worry about that. This is really just to keep us engaged and thinking and using our critical thinking. So we've got a few folks who are saying, no, this is not true. I think this is a myth. We've got one person who's like, I don't know. I think it could be true. The quality is not as good. And we've got a couple of folks who aren't quite sure. And then we've got about half a group just along for the ride, which is great. I'll go ahead and advance to the next slide and we can see what the slide deck says about this. So this is false. OA publications follow the same rigorous peer review methods as their conventional peers. However, you should be on the lookout for predatory journals. And so we're going to talk more about predatory journals in a little bit. But for right now, I want to talk about this peer review part. So if you've never done scholarly publishing before, you've probably mostly heard of peer review in the context of your faculty somewhere saying, make sure you give me peer-reviewed sources for this paper or for your project. But you don't necessarily know what that means. So this is a really handy little guide that shows how peer review works. Basically, step one is that editor receives the paper. If you don't know, that can be a sort of cold call. So maybe you've already written your article or you've developed an idea for an article and you actually approach the journal and submit it through part of their submission process, excuse me. Or you can write to something called a call for proposals. The nice thing about a call for proposal is it'll say, typically, this is what we're looking for in this special issue. You can think if your project is a good fit for that, and then you can actually submit your abstract and get pre-approval and then decide to commit to writing that article for that journal if you're accepted. So this editor, in this case, they're not saying how they receive the paper, but the editor receives the paper. The editor checks that the paper fits the journal's aims and scope. In this case, this is from a Taylor and Francis instruction about how they do this. So they look in that particular journal aims and scope on Taylor and Francis online. The editor selects reviewers. So usually 2 to 3 of the peers in your discipline are sent that paper. The reviewers review the paper and provide the editor with comments, suggestions, and recommendations. Those recommendations can include everything from minor changes, additional citations that you should include, to really big things like disagreements with the way that you did your research or theoretical underpinnings of the work. So peer review can include so many different types of feedback. The editor checks the reviews and sends them along to the authors, along with the editor's notes, typically sort of summarizing what the peer reviewers have said, as well as what the editor has said with respect to how well it fits the journal's aims and scope, and if there's any changes that need to be made there. The paper is then edited and resubmitted, and then the paper is accepted and moves into production and is published. This says 84% of authors rate their satisfaction with the peer review process at Taylor and Francis at an 8 or above. So just FYI, that's what that says over there. People like this peer review process they do. So this gives you a sense of what's all involved in peer review. And it's worth mentioning this because this is the same process that a legitimate open journal will also undertake. So a legitimate open journal that is open access, but is still scholarly and rigorous, is going to be using this exact same methodology as opposed to a predatory journal, which typically does not undergo any meaningful peer review. So again, we'll go into more specifics about predatory journals in a little bit, but to kind of just sort of summarize how regular peer review works. All right, our second myth for OA. Publishing open access means losing my copyright or other intellectual property rights. Sometimes people think I can't publish open access because I want to hold on to my rights on this. What do you think? Is this a myth? True, false? Not sure. Okay, so we've got about 5 no's and 2 yeses. We got about 7 active voters, so I'm gonna click through and we'll see who's right on this one. So for this one, that was false. OA does not give away or change your copyright. Others should still cite your work, just like they always have been, and you're still protected against theft of your intellectual property, including people plagiarizing you or otherwise infringing on your rights. This is a common question that comes up with Creative Commons licensing in general, and it makes sense because copyright is not something that we know a ton about, and then this is a modification on top of that. So there's lots of different information out there about Creative Commons licenses and how they work. This is a great sort of overview that probably handles the amount of knowledge you need for now. But if you want to dive into more in depth, definitely check out some of the links I've got in that document. So for Creative Commons licenses, the kind of idea is that they don't dissolve your copyright. What they allow you to do is to relax some of the specific constraints of copyright. So the American intellectual property system works in a way that as soon as you create something by virtue of being the creator and American citizen creating it in the US, it immediately has copyright that belongs to you. I don't know how it works with some other statuses per se, but we're just going to work with that one. So with that kind of perspective, anything that you created has a copyright, and you basically are have intellectual rights over it and then a sort of pragmatic financial right over it, right? You can sort of dictate how it's used, and ideally someone's not able to use your intellectual property in a way that they profit from it or something without your knowledge or awareness. And if they do, you can sue them and get your money back, right? Or get a claim on that. So for Creative Commons, part of the idea here is that in our scholarly work, we're often wanting to share things with a different intention than we would in a for-profit system, which is really what copyright has in mind, is protecting intellectual property in a for-profit environment. So Creative Commons licenses allow you to relax some of those elements of copyright, the ones that you want for a particular work, and thus share it more widely. So what this graphic is showing you is that there's the most permissive and open license, which is CC0. So this is where you're actually saying something is in the public domain. And when something is in the public domain, typically the way that it gets there is by time. And so you may have heard of this recently with some of the early versions of Mickey Mouse now being in the public domain, meaning I could make a t-shirt with Steamboat Mickey Mouse on it and print it and sell it on Etsy. And there's nothing Disney could do because it's a public domain thing. The kind of idea here is at some point in time, things belong to the sort of cultural zeitgeist as a whole, and we all have a right to use them. You can actually put something in the public domain much sooner outside of that time period if you want to. One of the kind of key things to know with this is that you don't hold as many attribution rights with this one. So this is the absolutely most open license. You should really think of this as kind of like you're just setting the item free out into the world and anything could happen with it. And you may or not even have your name attached to it. Typically in Creative Commons licenses, we really think of them as starting with the CC BY, and that's because that's the one you typically see people using the most when they want an open license, but they still need that attribution. So most of the time you're going to see CC BY. From here, there's different sort of mixes that you can add in, and the kind of key ingredients are this attribution, derivative, which is do you allow others to make changes and kind of edit or iterate on your work? Do you share alike, meaning do you allow others to change the licensing on those future things that they create, or do you insist that they keep some of your original licensing structure? And this non-commercial element, non-commercial meaning people can't use it for profit. It doesn't mean that a for-profit entity can't use it, but they can't use it in a way where they are generating income or profit or revenue off the resource. So these licenses then are showing you the sort of most open to the least open. CC BY and C and D means you can share this, but you need to attribute it to me. You can't use it in a commercial context, and I don't want you to edit it. So that is the most specific and kind of tight license, but it still allows some options actually over what regular copyright offers. I know this can be a little dry and confusing all at the same time. And so I want to show you a quick example in the Cite Me Maybe document, because I actually put a Creative Commons license on that document just to show you how this kind of works in process. So here I went to the Creative Commons license team has a license creator tool, and I put in the requirements that I wanted, and it created this for me. And so you can see that this particular document is shared under a Creative Commons license, attribute me, Marco Seiferle Valencia, non-commercial. So please don't use this in a for-profit, for-cost setting, and shared alike. So you can't take any of these restrictions off. This is basically what you should be looking for when you're seeing something in the wild and you're curious what its Creative Commons license is. These little numbers, or excuse me, letters afterwards are part of what tells you how you can use it and those restrictions. And then 4.0 is the number that refers to the license edition. So quite a bit about Creative Commons licenses. We could go on and on about them because they're pretty complex and fascinating, but just to kind of help you understand, that's kind of what's at play here. Typically, when you publish something in OA, it may have a Creative Commons license and it may not. So open access and Creative Commons are like complementary concepts, but they're not the same. So just because you use an open access license doesn't necessarily mean that you'll have any particular one of these Creative Commons licenses, but it's something to ask about. Okay, so let's keep going here. OA myth number 3, OA publishing is expensive. Thumbs up, thumbs down, or question mark? Yeah, question mark. I thought it was free, right? Some people are saying thumbs down. Any brave souls say thumbs up on that one? Couple folks no. Okay, let's dive in and see what's the truth. OA myth number 3, is OA publishing expensive? Kind of true. So authors often have to pay something called article processing charges. This can be very confusing because we just said at the start of the talk that open's about free. So why are there article processing charges? These costs can range from just a few $100s to as much as $5,000 to $10,000, $15,000. I feel like I've seen, I couldn't find a good source for that. So that's why it only says 5,000, but they can be quite high. So what's up with that? What is an article processing charge? Why is there cost associated with this? Why do authors have to pay it? And how is that just like those predatory journals that you've probably heard a little bit about? Let's talk about it. So this is an article processing charge infographic from a open access journal. It's not really important, the specific one, although it is linked in the document. And it's kind of showing you the breakdown of how they're spending those article processing charges. And the takeaway here is that basically there's a lot of work and production that goes into scholarly publishing. Some of it you think of as the researcher in person creating the scholarship and the article, but there's also a lot of work that goes into the actual publication of it, right? So this shows that about 42% of their article processing charges actually pay their science editors, their data editors, and the peer review staff. So the folks who are responsible for slinging articles around to experts and making sure they're getting reviewed. Peer reviewers, as far as I know, are never paid for peer review in legitimate circumstances. So when it says peer review staff, it means people who are facilitating all of that. Copy editing, typesetting, linking and tagging, posting and archiving. So paying someone to do all the copy editing and kind of manual, actually getting it in a document, looking good, everything formatted and ready to be printed, either digitally or in physical journal. So that is actually what they cite as the majority of their labor here for their article processing charges. And then there's a few other sort of administrative fees and kind of continued maintenance and function of this place fees. So this gives you a sense of why there's article processing charges, right? Just because we have changed that payment model where we're not asking the public to pay to access this research doesn't mean this process suddenly became free. So article processing charges are intended to help journals be able to do open access publishing, but they are tough, right? Because you may not be expecting to have to pay this money to publish your article. And so we'll talk a little bit about the funding strategies for that. And some of the different ways that open access publishing can work in general. So this I thought was a really handy little article. As you sort of sink into OA and learn more about it, you'll hear these different kinds of OA mentioned: gold OA, green OA, and hybrid OA. And all of these can be very confusing because, well, you're just learning OA and then you learn that there's all these different varieties within it. So let's actually start at the bottom. A hybrid journal is a journal that has a subscription-based journal and a paid open access option. So this is a little confusing, but let's just make up a journal. I'll call it the Journal of Chemistry. Don't think of the real one because there probably is one called that. But the Journal of Chemistry that I've just created is a hybrid journal. And what we do is we have some subscription-based articles where the library needs to pay to access those for you as a student to have access. And we also have a few open access articles. And if someone wants to publish open access, we say, well, because we don't make any money at the Journal of Chemistry when we publish something open access because we can't charge those subscription fees, you as the author have to pay an article processing charge. So in this situation, you can often see hybrid journals where you have an existing sort of traditional journal that is a subscription base, and now suddenly they publish things open. They often have those article processing charges. Another kind of open publishing is that green OA. Green OA is kind of like a little bit of a hack. And so basically what you do in a positive way, like a secret or a little hot tip. So one of the things that you can do with green OA is you can still publish in a subscription-based journal. Let's say you have a discipline that is very prestige sensitive and you need to publish in really reputable, high prestige journals that don't have open access options. You can actually publish in that subscription-based journal and then actually put your preprint in an OA repository. So that may be a repository that is held elsewhere, like a disciplinary focused one, or in a repository like we have here at the U of Idaho. We're creating something called Verso. It's a new platform we're launching. And that's going to be a place where faculty could actually hang preprints or do this effective green OA publishing. This is something that the publisher typically has to extend the right to you for, although I don't want to get too much into broad spectrum advice on that because people have different approaches to this. So some people actually don't clarify with their publisher first and just publish a lot of things green OA as a way of making sure their work's accessible. And then there's this gold OA route, right? So this is an open access journal that's fully open. It's not hybrid. They don't have any way to get their subscription costs meeting their needs as a publisher because they don't have subscription costs. And so those are going to have APC charges pretty much for everyone involved. So in that kind of case, you're in this open access journal, you're going to need to pay that APC or possibly have it waived. And then that is how you can actually have some immediate open access publishing. So we've been going for about 30 minutes here. I want to just take a moment and make sure, do we have any questions in the chat? Any questions on this specific topic? We'll keep on cruising, but if you've got any thoughts in your brain where you're like, wait, or can backtrack, feel free to throw them in the chat. Now's a great time. And I will double check. Okay. We were talking about preprints. I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is a very handy link that's on our helper document. And it is this "How open is your preprint" document, which, let me find it. It's right here. And this is a good one that's worth reviewing and holding on to if you ever are in a case where maybe you are going to use one of those preprint options. You can see how some of the Creative Commons licenses work in those cases. So this is just a specific graphic that kind of goes through how open is your preprint in a Creative Commons scenario. Okay, so OA myth number 4, predatory publishing. So OA publishing charges are the same as pay to publish journals. So we just learned that there's these OA publishing charges, and you may have heard, I'm not supposed to publish in things where I have to pay to publish in them. So maybe OA is a little sus. What do we think? Okay, got a couple of not sure's and a couple of no's. Don't think this is true. And that's good because it's not the same. Pay to publish journals do not follow peer review, edit, or provide other publishing services, and they are not scholarly and legitimate sources of publishing. However, they do rely on confusion about OA to help them trick people. So what do I mean by that? Well, oftentimes you'll get something like an email, and I'm going to jump forward here a little bit. And oftentimes they will reach out to you, especially as you start to have your little email out there on, your graduate student links on your website or something. You will start to get emails like this, and you'll get something that says, hey, we've heard such great things about you. I'm a manager of this particular journal. We're looking for peer reviewers, or we're looking for people to submit something. Is this something you could do? What's tough about this is you will occasionally get legitimate inquiries / requests to submit things in this format. And this is also a very popular way that predatory journals reach out and target people. So what is the approach? How can we figure this out? So there's a couple of great places that you can start for checking when you want to see if a journal is a legit open journal. So I've included these as links over here. The top one to know is the Directory of Open Access Journals. So this lists legit journals in different disciplines. You can browse by the specific discipline. It is international, so there are a lot of it's a lot of coverage in here that may or may not be relevant for you. So use these filters on the left to filter down, of course. But this basically is a complete listing of known open trusted journals. So with that email that I got, you could take the title of that journal, Archives of Clinical Case Studies, and actually see if it's in here, right? Archives of Clinical Case Studies. It's not in there. Does not bode well for that being a legit journal. Very rarely, there are journals that have recently become open and they're not listed in the Directory of Open Access Journals. So there might be other places that you want to check as well. I did include this Directory of Open Access books. You don't receive quite as many predatory or random requests about books. Sorry, I'll update that link. But it's a similar kind of listing of open books and open book publishers that'll help you understand if those are legit. Similarly, you can also go and see if that journal of question is on one of these predatory journals lists. These are top level lists that have sort of all disciplines covered in here, but you can also search within your specific discipline if you're interested. So these are just a couple of websites that I found that list out tons and tons of predatory journals. And something to keep in mind is that these are sort of like cryptocurrencies. They're just like always popping up new ones. And so something could definitely be a predatory journal and not be listed on one of these sites. But if it is listed on there, you can know for sure that it's not a good journal to interact with. Some other approaches for identifying if something is a legit open journal, to Google it and to read the publisher's about page. So for instance, some of those new journals that have recently become open aren't fully listed in the directory of open access journals yet, but you can actually read on that journal's about page and see what it says about how they're hybrid or gold or green. And because you came to this talk, you'll know what that means. Also, whenever you're in doubt, reach out to a librarian. We have a new open publishing librarian starting, but for now, just think of me, Marco SV at uidaho.edu, and I'd be happy to help you if you're wondering, is this legit or is this a predatory option? Okay, so there's that email example again. Finally, our last myth is articles published under OA licenses receive less citations than traditional publishing options. Is that true or false? What do you think? One not sure. Couple not sure's. Someone suspicious doesn't think this is true. All right, props to our 5 intrepid voters still hanging in there. Thank you all. You are making the session a reality. So let's take a look. That's false. OA published articles receive more citations. In general, they are more widely available and receive more citations. So here is an example graphic that I was able to find. So over here on the left, this shows articles published in 2020, and it shows about 2 million articles, if I'm reading that correctly, from top traditional publishers, and about 250,000 open articles from gold OA publishers, right? So this huge percentage difference in the sheer number of articles coming out. But when we look at the actual average citations from 2020, which involves looking back from 2017 to 2019, you actually see that there are more citations for those top gold OA publishers than there are for those top traditional publishers. So despite having this huge advantage in the sheer volume of articles that are coming out, you're actually still seeing more average citations per article for the top gold OA publishers versus the top traditional publishers. So in general, open access helps your research have a further reach. Some of these advantages include taxpayers having a sort of ethical and intellectual right to the property that you're making. They can actually see what you're doing, and you can know that you're benefiting the widest group of people. You see those higher citation rates. You also typically see more research in, you see more open access research published in policy decisions, partly just because it's that much more available. This is often called the citation advantage. There's a similar kind of concept called the abstract advantage, which is in cases where your indexed article has a fully available abstract, you often see more citation and use of the research than in cases where you don't. And when you think about it, that makes sense, right? People need to be able to find your research, to use it and to cite it. And open is a very powerful way to help make sure that your research has the furthest possible reach. This just kind of goes over a little bit more of that. I thought this stat was interesting. 70% of articles cited by the UK government are OA, which is much higher than the comparative sample. So I need to find a US version for this because I'm curious to see how our government works with open access articles. But again, like I said earlier, it's increasingly just a requirement of grants. So the last thing I kind of want to touch on before we wrap up is just, how do you pay for this? So in the cases where there are those article processing charges, what are some options? So UIdaho has an open access publishing fund that can cover up to $2,000 of costs for a single article. That's something that we open each year in the fall and the spring. I will say one of our disadvantages there is that we don't have as much money as we have demand for. So every year the fund goes very quickly within the first couple of weeks of it opening. So if you're curious to learn more about that, I did include, of course, a link to our website that covers all those details. You can reach out to me and with any questions you might have. This website's pretty comprehensive and goes through it all. The main things to know is your article needs to be published in a journal that's listed in the directory of open access journals, and it needs to be accepted / have an invoice within the correct period date. So when we open the fund at the end of this month, we'll be accepting articles that have been invoiced for July of 2024 or further. Jaleesa, what you got? I see your question there.
Yes, so Amanda Palmer from College of Graduate Studies also put in the chat that there is a publication fund for Moscow graduate and professional students through GPSA.
That is excellent. Let's try to put a link to that in our document if we can. If you have one, throw it in. Otherwise, let's before you log off, let's just make sure that we capture that, because I created a zone down here for our crowdsource link. So I would love to include that. That's a great resource. Thank you for mentioning. Like I said, one of the challenges is that we just have a lot more demand than we have money for in this fund. And so that's great to know about another local option. Some other options include looking for disciplinary funding. So that might involve searching your discipline, education, and open access funding and seeing what's out there in terms of funders and providers. That might also steer you towards some particular journals. If in searching that you notice, oh, this education journal from Taylor and Francis is offering XYZ kind of processing charge, maybe that's something that allows that to be a better option for you. Don't be shy about negotiating with the publisher. A lot of the publishers actually have clauses that say we charge article processing charges if you can pay them. If you can't pay them, let us know. So the article processing charge really is a sort of fixed fee in the sense that it's typically the same for each article, but it can be waived. And so if you have an open access article and a good publisher that you want to work with and you don't have a way to fund it, reach out to them and ask them about waiving those fees. Say, I applied for our OAPF and wasn't accepted, or we didn't have funds to cover me, and we can actually see what the publisher can do. I have seen people get their fees waived that way. So that's something to know. And then this is more a pre-planning thing, but make sure to write your costs into grants. And so I have included a very short video about how to do that. This is a brief 5-minute video about how to include APCs in your proposals. There's lots of other research out there as well, or resources out there as well on that. Feel free to reach out to me if you need some help, but just kind of remember this in advance when you're writing a grant, that you need to put those APCs in there. So with that, we're going to start wrapping up here. If you would, please rate your knowledge on these following topics. We'll see which one we covered the most in depth and which one maybe I'll add a little bit more next time. Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, folks, for participating throughout. And yeah, we're just going to kind of start closing this out a little bit. I'm going to show you a couple of slides about the graduate student essentials, and then I'll actually stop screen sharing and we can have a quick convo for any questions people have. All right. So this has been part of the Graduate Student Essential series. If you're curious to see some of our previous workshops, we've done a lot of them at this point. So check out this link here. You can also access the previous recordings on our YouTube channel, which I assume is linked off of there as well. And we have some great workshops coming up as well. So this has been Cite Me Maybe, Open Access Publishing for Graduate Students. So far, we've offered one on GIS resources, which is mapping if you don't know, and then general presentation strategies and tips. And we have 2 more left, getting started with popular library databases and teaching with primary sources and special collections, which I think will be an especially good one. So please make sure to come back for a future Graduate Student Essential series. And thank you so much for coming to this one today and your great participation. I really appreciate your time and attention. With that, I'm going to stop sharing and see what questions folks have. Donna, I noticed you came on camera, which is often a sign that people want to talk. So okay, no, I won't call on you then. That's all right. I see Mark's got his hand up though, which is a
No,
great
I
sign.
think that was an accident.
No problem, no problem. Mark, why don't you jump in with your question when you're ready?
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I believe there is a limit to the content. There's a limit to the content to which you can publish. That is the content that you can publish has a limit, isn't it?
Well, in what way? What do you mean?
Well, can you publish a 1,000-word article, a 2,000-word article?
I see. So in terms of that, that's really all up to the publisher. So these open publishers set their same sort of rules for an article. So for instance, Jaleesa and I just working on an article and it had a 6,000 word limit, right? So that's what it's going to be. The thing about the open access publishing though, is it's not like part of the article, it is the whole thing, right? So when you publish something OA, it is the full article, and whatever particular limits the journal has set, you follow just like normal. You know, it's MLA format, it's ALA, it's this many words, but there's not any other particular restrictions or built-in limitations. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Any other questions that folks have?
Well, maybe I will go ahead and ask one. You mentioned early on about, I don't know if this is a shift, but that more and more people are required to publish an open source. Can you just talk about that a little bit more?
Yes, and I will say I may actually ask Jaleesa to fill us in a little bit on this one. I have the honor and somewhat unenviable task of giving this presentation with an equal / greater expert in the room on OA things. So I will explain my understanding of that, and then we'll let Jaleesa come in with any clarifications. But basically, starting about, I'm just going to say like 2018 is when it got on my radar. A lot of federal agencies are now just requiring that publications that come out of big federal grants are OA. And part of the idea is, and maybe a really high watermark of bipartisan collaboration, people got together and said, it's not really fair that government agencies spend all this money on research and then it goes into these firewalled subscription journals where the journal makes a lot of money, but other researchers don't have access to it and the public doesn't have access to it. So within that, there became more traction around this like public science as a right and intellectual property belonging to the public. If our tax dollars fund it, taxpayers should have the fullest possible access. And so what you're seeing now is just in general, you get a big rangeland grant, there's a publication that you're writing, that funder wants to see that there's an OA outlet at the end of it. So where before, maybe 25 years ago, what you would be trying to do is impress them and being like, we're going to be in nature because that's the #1 impact factor in our discipline. And they're like, yeah, prestige and impact. We're now saying like scholarly prestige and impact are important, but so is OA, right? And so really what we'd want to see is we're publishing in the OA version of Nature, right? Because that's the most prestigious, impactful journal, and we're doing it open, which is how it adheres to these different requirements. So Jaleesa, is there anything? Yeah, for sure.
Thank you, Marcos. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Jaleesa, is there anything you'd add on to that or any specific clarification you might lend?
I think the only thing is of course it's going to be different discipline by discipline, right? And thinking about who your granting agency is, because the push towards OA is definitely much stronger in in the sciences, in medicine, and in fields like that. A lot of law publications are already open access, so that really is something that they've been doing for a long time. But in the humanities and social sciences, there's been more of a challenge having them maybe shift towards that open access model, both in terms of the outputs they're producing, like scholarly books, but also in terms of the type of research they are working on and the communities that they're working with. Because oftentimes with these grants, or even with an open access journal, they might have an expectation that researchers are making their data openly available to. And for some fields, and also some types of research projects, that can be incredibly challenging, especially if you're working with human subjects. How do you anonymize that data? How do you make it available for other people to use and maybe incorporate or build upon without potentially making it dangerous for some, making it problematic for someone to look at because they could identify who your research participants are, or if we're thinking about maybe research on native and indigenous lands, if they're calling out certain types of plants and their availability, if that data becomes freely available, what happens to kind of those natural areas in those places? And so I think that's something when we're seeing those grants and those calls for more open access, it's really, it can be more challenging in certain disciplines than in others. And I think those conversations are continuing. But everything that Marco said, I definitely second that. It's kind of a process that's continuing to move forward, and more disciplines are seeing that maybe the prestige of the journal is still important, but maybe less important than ensuring that your research is accessible and available to the people who need access to it, so that you can continue to help move your discipline forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Jaleesa. And great point too about how some disciplines have been doing this for a long time. ERIC comes to mind in education as a big education resource and database that publishes a lot of federally funded research and has existed sort of before the open branding did, but was arguably doing open in many ways. There was one quick question in the chat, which I don't know if someone resolved it, but I'll go ahead and answer it. It was a question about WordPress and OA and how that works. And that's a great question. OA in general and how we use it in our common parlance has sort of multiple meanings. Here we've really been talking about capital A open access, which really refers to this specific method of scholarly publishing in a peer-reviewed context. But in terms of something like a WordPress publication or site that you create, you could definitely put Creative Commons licensing on that and effectively have done open publishing with it. The tricky part is you wouldn't want to necessarily call it OA because of the way that OA implies all of that peer review and scholarly publishing stuff. Whereas a WordPress site, it can actually be kind of tough to get it to go through that type of review process, right? So people in the digital humanities have kind of a hard time because a lot of the work and scholarship that you produce are these really great digital websites that can have really high quality scholarship on it, but we haven't fully established a peer review process for that. It almost falls into sort of in the creative disciplines, when artists need a portfolio review. So that's sort of an emerging space. Something like that, self-publishing on WordPress, could be a great way though to use those Creative Commons licenses and sort of achieve the same effect, right? You're putting your stuff out there and you're allowing it to be used and remixed in more expansive ways, but you're still retaining your copyright. Oh, Jaleesa has a little note to me. We do have one session that got cut off. Sorry about that, Jaleesa. Good to know. And that's making research data management easier on Wednesday, 9/25. So if that's a topic you need, make sure to come back and check that one out. Okay, well, with that, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate all of you coming and your participation and questions. This was very exciting and fun for me to do. Mark, yeah, jump out there.
Yes, can we have recordings of your previous workshops?
Yes.
Is it available?
Yes, they are on the library YouTube, but let me see if I can easily grab those while I talk. And I will also put the link to them in the that helper document that I made. So, Jaleesa, is there I'm just going to give the U Idaho Library YouTube page. And if you browse that, you will see some playlists for the previous year's graduate student essentials. I don't know if we have one that has all of them or if they're primarily done by year, but you'll see, you'll recognize the little slide starter here. You'll see it for the most recent ones from this year. And then there's the curated list. Oh, yep, Jaleesa, thank you. So, and I'll update that. Okay. Well, with that, we'll probably go ahead and stop that recording, I think, Julissa, if that sounds okay. And again, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your time and attention and participation and making this a great session. Take care.